Welcome to Nightverse lore. Oh, geez, another dimension of naps.
Hey there, sleepyheads. Glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. He arrived with the morning fog, the way a gentle thought settles into a quiet mind. One moment, the old pier stretched empty into the grey-green harbour, weathered planks creaking their familiar song to the tide. And the next moment he was simply there, a boy of perhaps 12 years, sitting at the very end with his feet dangling just above the water's gentle reach. The lighthouse had swept its beam across these docks 1,000 times, but somehow this morning felt different, as if the light had paused to rest on something it had been searching for without knowing. His stillness was the first thing people noticed. Not the fidgety energy of most children, but the deep calm of someone who had learned to be fully present in each moment. When Mrs. Chen walked down from her bait shop, with her morning coffee steaming in the salt air, she found herself moving more quietly than usual, her footsteps softening on the worn boards, as if she'd entered a place of prayer. "Morning, sweetheart," she said gently, settling onto a nearby crate, with the careful movements of someone who understood that some moments required tenderness. "You're up early." The boy turned to look at her, and Mrs. Chen felt her breath catch softly in her throat. His eyes held the color of deep water, but more than that, they carried a depth that seemed to have witnessed many seasons turning. Not sad exactly, but vast in the way that oceans are vast, holding countless stories in their quiet depths. "I like the morning," he said simply, his voice clear and unhurried. Everything feels possible when the day is just beginning. There was something in the way he spoke that made Mrs. Chen want to sit a little longer, to let her usual morning routines wait, while she shared this peaceful corner of the world. "I'm Mrs. Chen," she offered. "Been watching these waters for more years than I care to count. What should I call you?" He considered this question with the seriousness of someone choosing words like stones for a garden path. "People have called me Sanchez," he said finally, and somehow the name seemed to settle around him like a coat that had always been his size. "Sanchez," Mrs. Chen repeated, tasting the sound. "That's a good name. Strong but gentle." She noticed then what he held carefully in his lap, a leather journal so worn and soft it looked like it had been carried through decades of careful hands. "That looks like it has some stories in it." Sanchez's fingers traced the cover with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. "It has faces," he said quietly. "And equations that sound like lullabies when you read them, right?" He opened the journal slightly, and Mrs. Chen glimpsed sketches of remarkable detail, faces she didn't recognize, but that somehow felt familiar, as if she'd seen them in dreams. Between the portraits, symbols flowed across the pages in scripts that predated any language she knew, yet they seemed to pulse with their own quiet music. As the morning unfolded around them, other townspeople began their daily rhythms. Fishermen prepared their boats with movements that seemed somehow gentler than usual. Children on their way to school found themselves walking more slowly, noticing the way sunlight played on the water's surface. Even the seagulls seemed to call more softly, as if Sanchez's presence had reminded the entire harbor that some mornings deserved to be whispered rather than shouted. Captain Bruno paused in coiling his ropes to tip his hat to the boy, though he couldn't have said why the gesture felt necessary. Young Maria, hurrying past with her school bag, found herself stopping to watch how Sanchez fed breadcrumbs to the gulls, not throwing them carelessly, but placing each piece with deliberate kindness, as if each bird mattered individually. "You have a way about you," Mrs. Chen observed, watching the gentle ripples of calm that seemed to emanate from where Sanchez sat. "Makes people remember to be kind." Sanchez smiled at that, an expression so genuine and unguarded that Mrs. Chen felt something warm settle in her chest. "Everyone already knows how to be kind," he said. "Sometimes they just need a quiet moment to remember." As the sun climbed higher and the fog began its slow retreat toward the horizon, a woman appeared at the top of the harbor steps. Eleanor, the town librarian, stood with her coffee cup cradled in both hands, her grey hair caught up in its usual practical bun. She had the bearing of someone who understood that the most important stories often happened in the spaces between words. She descended the steps slowly, her gaze fixed on the boy who sat so peacefully at the water's edge. When she reached the pier, she didn't speak immediately, but simply stood nearby. adding her own quiet presence to the morning's gentle gathering. "The library opens in an hour," she said finally, her voice carrying the warmth of someone extending an invitation rather than making an announcement. "There's a corner by the window where the light pulls just right for reading." "And writing." Her eyes moved meaningfully to the journal in Sanchez's hands. Sanchez looked up at her with those deep, knowing eyes, and Elena felt the same recognition that Mrs. Chen had experienced, the sense of meeting someone who carried old wisdom in young hands. "I'd like that," he said simply. "I have some stories that might want to be shared." As the harbor fully awakened around them and the day's ordinary magic began to unfold, Sanchez carefully closed his journal and stood with the unhurried grace of someone who moved through the world like water finding its natural course. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new gentle encounters, new moments of quiet wonder. But for now, there was simply this: a boy, a journal, and the promise of stories waiting to be discovered in the warm corner of a library, where afternoon light would soon pool like liquid gold. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep, blessing the water with its steady rhythm, and somewhere in the town above, the day's first bread was beginning to fill the air with the scent of home. The library's heavy oak door opened with barely a whisper, as if even the hinges understood the reverence required in Elena's sanctuary of stories. Sanchez stepped inside and felt something settle deep in his chest, the particular peace that comes from being surrounded by thousands of tales waiting patiently on their shelves. Morning light streamed through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across worn wooden floors, polished smooth by decades of quiet footsteps. Elena moved through the space with fluid grace, her fingers trailing along book spines in an unconscious gesture of greeting. She led Sanchez to a corner where an overstuffed armchair sat bathed in the kind of light that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. Dust motes floated in the golden air, moving so steadily they seemed like tiny stars on patient journeys to nowhere in particular. "This was always my favorite spot," Eleanor said softly, adjusting the chair's angle toward the window. "Something about the way the light falls here makes even the most difficult passages feel manageable." She watched as Sanchez settled into the chair with the careful movements of someone who understood that some places were sacred as Elena disappeared between the stacks to fetch tea. Sanchez opened his journal and began to read, but not in the way most people read. His fingertips moved across the pages like someone reading Braille, though the text was clearly visible. Each sketch seemed to respond to his touch, the pencil lines appearing to deepen and warm under his gentle attention. The equations scattered between portraits hummed with their own quiet music, mathematical relationships that described the curve of a smile, the weight of a tear, the precise angle of hope in someone's eyes. Elena returned with steaming cups, the tea's fragrance carrying hints of chamomile and something else that reminded Sanchez of gardens he had known in other seasons. She settled nearby, content to share the silence while he worked. There was something profoundly restful about watching him tend to his journal, the way he turned each page with the reverence of someone greeting old friends. "You read like my grandmother used to," Eleanor observed quietly. She said books spoke to her through her hands as much as her eyes. Sanchez looked up, those deep eyes reflecting recognition. "Stories live in more places than just words," he said. "Sometimes they hide in the spaces between letters, in the memory of all the hands that have held the pages." He gestured toward the surrounding shelves. "This place holds more stories than just the ones written down." Eleanor felt a shiver of understanding. In all her years here, she had sensed exactly what Sanchez described, the presence of untold stories lingering in quiet corners, the way certain books seem to call to specific readers. "You feel it too," she said, not quite a question. "Every library is a living thing," Sanchez replied with quiet certainty. "They remember every person who has ever sought comfort in their silence." He closed his journal carefully. "Would you like me to help with the mending?" Elena blinked in surprise. She hadn't mentioned the stack of damaged books waiting in her office. "How did you know?" Sanchez's smile carried gentle understanding. Hurt books have their own sound, like anything that's been well loved and needs tending. They spent the morning in Elena's cozy office, where damaged books waited for healing. Sanchez worked with materials that seemed to respond to his touch in ways that defied explanation. Paper that had been brittle became supple under his fingers. Torn pages aligned themselves perfectly, as if remembering their original wholeness. A cookbook from the 1940s, its spine completely separated, slowly knitted itself back together under his patient attention. "That belonged to Mrs. Morrison," Elena said softly. "She said it held 50 years of Sunday dinners and birthday cakes." "It still does," Sanchez replied, running his palm over the restored cover. "Love doesn't leave just because the binding gets weak. Sometimes it just needs someone to help it remember how to hold things together." As afternoon light began to slant through the window, children started arriving for weekly story hour. Elena could hear their voices in the main room, excited whispers and the shuffle of small feet finding places on the reading carpet. She looked at Sanchez with a question in her eyes. "Would you like to meet them?" she asked. "They're good children. Curious and kind." Sanchez nodded, carefully setting aside his work. As they walked back into the main library, Elena noticed how the children's chatter softened. Not from fear, but from the same inexplicable sense of reverence that seemed to follow Sanchez wherever he went. The afternoon sun streaming through windows seemed warmer somehow, and even the dust motes appeared to dance more slowly, as if time itself had decided to pause. Young Timothy, usually the most restless, found himself sitting perfectly still, wide eyes fixed on the boy who looked only slightly older than himself, but carried the quiet dignity of someone who had been listening to stories for much longer than seemed possible. As Elena began the day's reading, she noticed Sanchez settle cross-legged beside her chair, and the children naturally gravitated toward him, like flowers turning toward light. Through the office's back window, she glimpsed something that made her pause. A flash of green beyond the glass, the suggestion of leaves moving in a breeze that carried the scent of rosemary and old rain. Sanchez's eyes followed her gaze, and for just a moment, his expression held the gentle anticipation of someone recognizing a place they hadn't visited yet, but somehow knew they would. When the last child's footsteps faded from the library's front steps, Elena began her quiet afternoon ritual of shelving returned books. But today, Sanchez found himself drawn to that window again, to the glimpse of green that had caught his attention during story hour. The light falling through the glass seemed different now, warmer somehow, as if it were illuminating a path rather than simply a view. "The garden calls to you too," Elena observed softly, noticing how his gaze lingered on the weathered door that led to the library's forgotten back corner. "It's been wild for years, though Iris still tends it in her own way. She says plants remember things we've forgotten." Sanchez closed his journal with the same gentle care he used for everything, and Elena nodded toward the door, with the understanding that passes between people who recognize each other's need for quiet spaces. The heavy wooden door opened with barely a whisper, revealing a narrow path that wound between overgrown hedges toward something that felt more like a secret than a garden. The moment Sanchez stepped outside, the world shifted into a different rhythm. Here, behind the library's formal walls, nature had been allowed to remember its own wisdom. Roses climbed wooden trellises in glorious abundance, their blooms appearing in impossible profusion for the season. Herbs grew in fragrant clusters along stone borders, worn smooth by decades of gentle tending, their scents mingling in the warm air like old friends sharing stories. He walked slowly along the moss-softened path, and something remarkable happened with each step. Not dramatic or showy, but gentle as breathing. A wilting stem seemed to straighten slightly. Late-season buds appeared to consider opening, despite the advancing autumn, and the very air grew thick with the kind of peace that makes time forget to hurry. At the garden's heart, on a weathered stone bench half hidden beneath cascading ivy, sat an elderly woman with silver hair braided with small flowers. Her hands, gnarled like ancient roots but infinitely gentle, were carefully tending a small potted plant. When she looked up, her eyes held the same depth Sanchez recognized in still water, the kind that reflects sky and holds secrets in equal measure. "Well now," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of earth after rain, "it's not often I see someone who makes the moonflowers think about blooming in daylight." She gestured with a soft laugh toward a cluster of pale, trumpet-shaped flowers that were indeed beginning to unfurl their delicate edges, despite the afternoon sun. "I'm Iris," she continued, setting down her small trowel with the reverence of someone placing a sacred tool. "Been having conversations with this garden for 40 years now, though I suspect it's been teaching me more than I've been teaching it." She studied Sanchez with curious kindness, the way someone might regard a particularly beautiful sunset, with appreciation rather than analysis. Sanchez settled beside her on the bench, feeling the stone's warmth seep through his clothes. "It's peaceful here," he said simply. "Like the plants are all listening to the same quiet song." Iris smiled at that, an expression that seemed to light up not just her face, but the surrounding flowers as well. "Exactly right. Some people are born with what my grandmother called green souls, not envious green, but the green of growing things. They help other living beings remember their own capacity for flourishing." As they sat together, Iris began sharing the garden stories. She spoke of how comfrey was called knitbone because it helped broken things heal properly, how forget-me-nots carried messages between hearts, separated by distance or time, how rosemary was for remembrance, but also for the kind of gentle forgetting that lets old wounds close cleanly. "Gardens remember," she said, her fingers trailing through the soil beside the bench. "Every hand that's tended them, every song that's been sung among their rows, every tear that's watered their roots. This place holds 40 years of my mornings, but it held other stories long before I arrived." Sanchez listened with his whole being, the way he listened to everything, completely present, asking nothing, offering the gift of patient attention. As afternoon light filtered through grape leaves overhead, creating patterns that shifted like slow music, he began to understand that he had found another sanctuary, another place where his unusual nature would be welcomed as simply another kind of growing thing. When Iris offered him tea from a thermos that seemed to stay perfectly warm despite the cooling air, he accepted it with both hands, the way one receives a blessing. The liquid tasted of chamomile and something else, perhaps the memory of rain, or the promise of seeds sleeping safely in dark earth until spring called them home. As the sun began its gentle descent toward the harbor, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber, the moonflowers finally completed their impossible afternoon blooming. Iris didn't gasp or exclaim over the wonder of it. She simply nodded with deep satisfaction, as if witnessing exactly what she had expected all along. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said, as they prepared to return to the world beyond the hedge. "When the dew is still deciding whether to stay, when the plants are most honest about their dreams, we'll listen to what wants to grow." Sanchez looked from the moonflowers to the distant lighthouse beam beginning its evening sweep, feeling the day's peace settle around him, like a blanket he would carry forward. In this garden, surrounded by growing things that bloomed according to their own mysterious schedule, he had found another room in the house of his belonging. Morning after morning, Sanchez returned to the garden as the seasons painted their gentle stories across the harbor town. Autumn arrived with leaves that turned to copper and gold. Winter hushed the world under soft blankets of snow, and spring coaxed shy green shoots from the earth's patient sleep. Through each turning, Sanchez remained exactly as he had been that first day on the pier, 12 years old, with eyes that held the depth of still water and hands that moved through the world with careful tenderness. In the garden, Iris taught him the old names of things, her silver hair growing whiter with each passing season, while her wisdom deepened like roots finding richer soil. She showed him how comfrey was called knitbone because it helped broken things heal properly, how rosemary was for remembrance and the gentle kind of forgetting that lets old wounds close cleanly. Sanchez learned these lessons not with effort, but with affection, feeling the garden's seasons gather around him like a patient song. But as time flowed like water around a stone, something began to settle in Sanchez's heart, not bitter sadness, but a gentle melancholy like watching beautiful ships sail toward horizons he would never reach. He saw Timothy grow from restless child to thoughtful teenager, his voice deepening as he discovered dreams of engineering and distant cities. Little Sarah, once shy during story hour, now recited poetry with confidence that bloomed like morning flowers. Even baby Marcus, who had slept through countless tales in his mother's arms, now ran through the library, asking endless questions about everything his curious eyes encountered. Elena noticed it first, the way Sanchez would pause while mending books, his hands still on the pages, as he listened to the children's changing voices through the windows. She saw how he would smile when they shared their dreams of high school and the wide world beyond their harbor. But the smile carried something wistful now, like someone watching birds prepare for a migration they could never join. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Elena said one afternoon, settling beside him where afternoon light still pooled like liquid gold. Watching them discover who they're becoming, Sanchez nodded, his fingers tracing the cover of his eternal journal. They're like flowers, he said quietly. Each one blooming in their own time, reaching toward their own particular light. He paused, watching dust motes dance in the golden air. But flowers know when their season comes. They don't have to wonder if they'll ever change. Eleanor felt her heart contract with gentle understanding. Some people are meant to be the constants, she said softly. The steady points that help others navigate their changes, like lighthouses. In the garden that evening, as Iris prepared the beds for winter's rest, she noticed the same tender sadness that had touched Elena's heart. Sanchez sat on their usual bench, watching the last butterflies of the season dance among flowers that bloomed with impossible persistence in his presence. The weight of staying while everything else changes, Iris said without preamble, settling beside him with understanding that needed no explanation. I've seen it in very old trees. They watch forests grow up around them, see countless seasons of smaller plants live their whole lives in the space of a single ring of growth. Do the trees mind? Sanchez asked, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone asking a question that mattered deeply. Iris smiled with the wisdom of 4 decades spent listening to growing things. The wise ones learn to find joy in the constancy itself. They become libraries of seasons, holders of memory. Every ring tells the story of a year someone else lived. She gestured toward the garden around them. This place remembers every child who played here, every moment of joy and sorrow that has blessed this soil. As autumn deepened, Sanchez began to understand something new about his nature. The children who had grown beyond his apparent age still sought him out, but differently now. Not as a playmate, but as a gentle constant in their changing world. They would sit beside him during story hour, sharing their teenage worries and dreams with the trust. Reserved for someone who listened without judgment, Elena left him small gifts that acknowledged his unique burden, a cup that kept tea warm longer than it should, books about travelers who found home in unexpected places, a soft lamp that cast particularly peaceful light for evening reading. These weren't attempts to solve his mystery, but gentle recognitions that some forms of caring required no explanation. One evening, as the lighthouse beam swept across water that reflected the first stars, Sanchez wrote in his journal with renewed purpose. His pages began to include new portraits, Timothy's changing features, Sarah's growing confidence, little Marcus taking his first steps. Not because he feared forgetting them, but because he was learning to see his unchanging nature as a gift that allowed him to hold space for others' beautiful transformations. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep, and somewhere in the town above, children dreamed of futures they were growing toward, watched over by someone who would remember every step of their journey, with the tenderness of someone who understood that love. Unlike bodies never needs to age, the lighthouse keeper's cottage had stood empty for 3 weeks, its windows dark against the evening sky, when the moving truck finally wound its way up the cliff road on a morning when the harbor wore silver mist like a gentle shawl. Sanchez noticed it first from the garden, where he was helping Iris tend the late spring bulbs that insisted on blooming in their own mysterious time. The truck moved slowly, carefully, as if its cargo were precious rather than simply practical. Elena saw them next, a man with steady hands and the bearing of someone who understood that some responsibilities were sacred, followed by a girl whose laughter reached the library before she did. The girl moved with the unhurried confidence of someone completely at home in her own skin, her fingers already stained with paint that caught the morning light like small jewels. By afternoon, the town had learned what small towns always learn, that Captain Hendricks had finally retired to his sister's farm inland, and the new keeper was called Raphael, soft-spoken, careful with details, the kind who fixed things before they broke by attending to every small whisper and creak. His daughter was Maya, 14 and fearless, with dark hair that caught sunlight like water, and eyes that seemed to catalogue every interesting shadow the world offered. Sanchez met her the way he met everyone, gently, as if stepping into a story he was meant to tend rather than direct. She was sitting on the pier where he had first appeared all those seasons ago, an easel balanced on the weathered planks, mixing colors on a palette held steady by paint-stained fingers. Her head tilted as she studied the way morning light transformed ordinary dock posts into something worthy of careful attention. "You're..." The one who reads with his fingers, she said without looking up from her canvas, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who understood that the world held more wonders than most people bothered to notice. And makes broken things remember how to be whole. Most teenagers would have seen his apparent age and dismissed him as too young for real conversation, but Maya studied him with the same attention she gave her paintings. There was no mockery in her voice, no curiosity about his unchanging nature, only the gentle recognition of someone who saw beauty in things as they were, rather than as they were expected to be. "And you paint light," Sanchez replied, gesturing toward her canvas, where she had somehow captured not just the pier but the feeling of morning settling softly over the harbor. "That's harder than it looks," Maya grinned, an expression so genuine and unguarded that it reminded Sanchez of sunrise breaking through clouds. "Most people think painting is about copying what you see, but really it's about showing what you feel when you look at something." She stepped aside so he could see her work more clearly. Like this morning, it wasn't just fog and water. It was the way the whole world felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something beautiful to happen. They fell into easy conversation, the kind that flows naturally between people who recognize something familiar in each other's way of seeing. Maya showed him how she mixed colors to capture the exact shade of water at different times of day, how she used brush strokes to convey the feeling of wind rather than just its visible effects. Sanchez shared some of the sketches from his journal, faces that seemed to breathe on the page, equations that somehow described the mathematics of kindness. "Want to see the view from up there?" Maya asked as afternoon light began to slant toward evening, gesturing toward the lighthouse tower. "The light's different from inside. And I have a feeling you'd understand what I mean about seeing things from new angles." The lighthouse stairs sang under their feet, old iron treads that Maya had already learned to tap in certain places, coaxing low notes that sounded like sea shanties, remembered from another time. As they climbed, she opened narrow windows to let in stripes of wind that carried the scent of distant rain and lifted their hair with gentle insistence. In the lantern room, glass curved around them like a calm wave, and the great lens stood like a jewel, all facets and quiet power. Raphael adjusted settings with the expertise of someone who respected every screw and hinge, glancing toward the children with a small smile that recognized a meeting that didn't need adult supervision to be safe. "See that line just there?" Maya pointed toward the horizon where gray shifted almost imperceptibly to deeper slate. "Storm shelf. It's slow-moving. We've got until midnight before the first real gusts arrive." Sanchez followed her gaze and felt the world widen the way it always did at new vantage points. From here, the town's roofs looked like folded paper, the harbor boats like stitched buttons on a woolen coat. Maya brought out a small sketchbook, its paper marked with salt freckles and thumb-smudged blues. "Draw how it sounds," she said. Handing him a piece of charcoal worn into the shape of a question mark, he didn't hesitate. The page accepted lines the way sand accepts footsteps, and soon there was something that wasn't quite sky and wasn't quite song, but carried a whisper of both. Maya watched with quiet approval, not asking how he'd learned or who had taught him, simply letting the moment be itself. As evening settled over the harbor and the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep, Sanchez reflected on the gift of unexpected friendship. Maya didn't question his ageless nature or treat him like a curiosity. She simply accepted him as someone worth knowing, someone whose perspective might add new colors to her understanding of the world. Walking back toward the library as stars began their ancient conversation with the sea, Sanchez felt something shift in his heart, not the weight lifting entirely, but a new lightness settling beside it. The gentle melancholy that had wrapped around him like morning mist now shared space with something warmer, the particular joy of meeting someone who spoke his language of careful attention and quiet wonder. In his journal that night, he wrote about paint-stained fingers and the way laughter could sound like wind chimes, about climbing toward light and finding friendship in the spaces between words. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, blessing the water with steady rhythm, and somewhere in the keeper's quarters above, a girl with an artist's eye dreamed of capturing light itself on canvas, while below in the town, a boy who never aged discovered that some forms of constancy could bloom into new kinds of beauty. The friendship between Sanchez and Maya grew like morning lights spreading across still water. Gradually, naturally without effort or hurry, they met most days on the pier, where Maya would set up her easel and Sanchez would bring his journal, both working in companionable silence while the harbor woke around them. Sometimes she painted while he wrote, their creative rhythms finding harmony, the way two musicians learn to breathe together during a gentle song. It was during these quiet hours that fragments of Sanchez's true nature began to surface, like pressed flowers falling from the pages of an old book. He would mention, almost casually, how the northern lights had danced above these waters during a particularly harsh winter in 1847, describing them as spirits celebrating something too beautiful for words. Or he would hum a melody while Maya mixed her colors, a lullaby so ancient and lilting that it seemed to carry the memory of countless bedtimes in its gentle notes. "That bakery there," he said one morning, gesturing toward what was now Chen's electronics shop, housed to fill the whole street with the smell of rising dough before dawn. Mrs. Kowalski made bread that tasted like Sunday mornings and grandmother's hands. She said the secret was letting the dough rest long enough to dream. Maya looked up from her canvas, where she was capturing the way morning light transformed ordinary storefronts into something worthy of careful attention. She didn't ask when this had been, sensing somehow that some stories existed outside the usual boundaries of time. Instead, she simply nodded and continued painting, adding a warmth to the windows that suggested the memory of fresh bread still lingered there. Elena noticed these gentle revelations too. When Sanchez hummed that ancient lullaby while helping her mend books, she paused with recognition blooming soft in her chest. "My great-grandmother used to sing something like that," she whispered. "I thought no one else remembered it." These weren't boasts or tales told for attention, but memories that slipped out like morning mist rising from warm water. Elena, with her librarian's instinct for patterns and stories, began to understand that Sanchez carried within him something precious. Not just knowledge of the town's history, but the living memory of how it had felt to be part of that history. In the garden, Iris recognized it even more clearly, when Sanchez mentioned a particular variety of rose that had grown wild here decades ago, describing petals the color of bruised plums at dusk that smelled of rain and forgotten promises. She straightened with profound understanding. "You're a living library," she said softly, her silver hair catching sunlight like spun moonbeams. "You carry the memories of this place, not just the stories, but the very scent and feel of them, like the earth remembers every seed it's ever held." From that day forward, their time together took on new purpose. Iris began bringing out old photographs, and Sanchez would tell her about the people in them, their hopes, their small triumphs, the way they laughed when they were truly happy. Eleanor set up a quiet corner near the library window where they could record these gentle remembrances, treating each story like a pressed flower to be preserved between pages. "We'll keep them safe," Elena said, understanding that Sanchez's memories were gifts that connected the present to something larger and more enduring. Like pressed flowers in a book, so they don't lose their shape or their sweetness. Maya watched this gentle documentation with her artist's eye, beginning to understand that Sanchez was like a bridge between what was and what is. She started incorporating glimpses of the past into her paintings, the pier as it had been in other decades, with different boats and faces but the same essential spirit of people making their living from the sea's generous moods. "It's like you helped the town remember its own heart," she said one afternoon as they climbed the lighthouse stairs together. "You're the thread that connects us to our own continuity." As autumn painted the harbor in shades of amber and gold, Sanchez felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had found not just acceptance, but appreciation for the gift he carried. His memories weren't burdens but treasures, stories that helped each present moment feel connected to the countless lives that had loved this place before. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep, blessing the water with steady rhythm. And somewhere in the town below, people settled into evening routines that echoed patterns established by generations who had found peace in this harbor, watched over by someone who remembered it all with the tenderness of someone who understood that love. Unlike bodies, never needs to age. As winter softened into spring and spring bloomed into summer, Maya grew in the way that flowers grow. Not just taller but deeper, her paintings becoming more complex, her dreams expanding like circles, spreading from stones dropped in still water. She was 15 now, then 16. Her laughter still bright as wind chimes, but carrying new notes of someone discovering the vast landscape of her own possibilities. Sanchez watched this transformation with the tender attention of someone who had seen countless seasons turn and understood that beauty lay not in permanence, but in the courage to unfold completely. He saw how Maya's eyes began to linger on the horizon during their morning sessions on the pier, how she painted not just what was before her, but what might be waiting beyond the edge of the visible world. Their conversations grew richer during these months, touched with the bitter sweetness of understanding that growing up meant growing towards something that would eventually lead away from this harbor. Maya spoke of art schools in distant cities, of galleries where light fell differently through tall windows, of teachers who might help her discover techniques she couldn't even imagine yet. "There's so much I want to learn," she said one afternoon, as they sat in Iris's garden, watching bees move through lavender with purposeful grace. "Sometimes I feel like I could paint for 100 years and still not capture everything I see." Sanchez smiled at that, his eyes holding the gentle understanding of someone who had indeed watched the world for longer than most people could imagine. "The beautiful thing about art," he said softly, "is that it's not about capturing everything. It's about sharing the way one heart sees the world, so other hearts can remember how to see wonder in ordinary moments." He began teaching her in his quiet way about the spaces between moments, how to notice the pause between a wave and the shore, how to find peace in the knowledge that everything changes, except the love that connects us to each other. They would sit together as evening light painted the harbor in shades of gold and rose, and Maya would learn to see not just the colors, but the emotions they carried. "Look there," Sanchez would say, pointing toward where sunset touched the water. "See how the light doesn't just reflect, it transforms? That's what happens when we really pay attention to anything. We don't just see it, we become part of its beauty." Maya absorbed these lessons like earth absorbing gentle rain, her paintings beginning to carry something that couldn't be taught in any classroom, a quality of presence that made viewers pause and remember moments when the world had felt particularly alive. Helena, visiting one evening, stood before Maya's recent canvas and felt tears gather softly in her eyes. "She's learned to paint the feeling of being held," Elena whispered to Sanchez. "That's a gift that can't be learned from books." As summer deepened, Maya began a special project in the garden, where she and Sanchez spent their quietest hours. She set up her largest canvas among the roses and herbs, positioning it so the ancient apple tree and weathered stone bench were within view. For weeks she worked on something different from her usual landscapes, a portrait that captured not just Sanchez's appearance, but his essence, surrounded by all the town's seasons at once. When it was finished, she unveiled it in the fading light of a late afternoon. Sanchez looked at it for a long time, seeing himself painted with winter's depth in his eyes, autumn's patience in his stillness, spring's warmth in his smile, and summer's enduring strength in his presence. "It's every moment," he whispered, "and every moment is beautiful." In return, Sanchez took Maya's worn sketchbook and on a blank page wrote her a lullaby. Not words, but symbols and gentle lines that, when traced with a finger, seemed to hum with melody. The sound of waves against shore, leaves rustling in evening breeze, the lighthouse beam's patient sweep. A quiet blessing meant to help her remember the peace they had shared. As college acceptance letters began arriving with spring's first flowers, both Maya and Sanchez felt the gentle current carrying them toward change. These weren't sad realizations, but natural ones, like recognizing that winter must make way for spring. Their friendship had become something precious and enduring, not despite the fact that it would soon change form, but because of the love they had learned to give each other without conditions. During evening climbs up the lighthouse stairs, Maya talked about spaces she wanted to explore, light she wanted to chase in different cities. Sanchez listened with deep attention, offering not advice but presence, the gift of someone who understood that the most loving thing he could do was help her feel supported in her reaching. "You'll take this place with you," he said one evening as they watched the beam sweep across water that held early stars. "Not as something that holds you back, but as something that teaches you to recognize home wherever you find beauty and kindness." Their conversations became gifts they were giving each other for all the different kinds of growing they would need to do. Each shared silence a blessing for journeys that would take them to new understandings of what it meant to carry love across distance and time. As Maya's acceptance letter arrived with the morning mail, carried by Mrs. Patterson's gentle hands up the lighthouse path, Sanchez felt something shift in the harbor's rhythm. Not dramatic, but subtle as the way light changes when clouds gather softly overhead. The letter bore the seal of the Rhode Island School of Design, and when Maya opened it with trembling fingers, her gasp of joy carried both celebration and the first whisper of goodbye. "I got in," she breathed, her voice holding wonder, and something that sounded like the distant call of ships preparing for long voyages. Sanchez felt his heart expand with genuine happiness, even as he understood that this beautiful news would reshape the geography of their friendship. But Maya's approaching departure seemed to awaken something deeper in Sanchez, a recognition that his gift lay not in preventing endings, but in helping them feel complete, like the final note of a lullaby that helps everything settle into peaceful sleep. The town began seeking his presence during their own quiet transitions, though none of them could have explained exactly why. Elena's oldest library cat, Mittens, had been a fixture for longer than most residents could remember. When Elena found her one morning, curled in her favorite sunny spot but breathing no more, she looked up to find Sanchez already there, as if he had sensed the gentle completion from across the harbor. He sat beside Elena without words, his hand resting on Mittens' soft fur with the same reverence he showed ancient books. "She had a good life," Elena whispered through quiet tears. 17 years of warm windowsills and children's stories. Sanchez helped her wrap Mittens in soft linen, and they buried her beneath the rosemary by the garden gate, where bees would visit faithfully. In his journal that evening, he sketched the cat sleeping in a square of sunlight, writing in careful script, "A life well napped." As autumn painted the harbor in shades of amber and gold, Iris invited him to join her final rose harvest. They moved through the garden together, choosing blooms with patient attention. The last roses surprised them with their fragrance, deeper somehow, as if each petal had stored every afternoon of the season. "We don't harvest because they're ending," Iris said, placing worn shears in his gentle hands. "We harvest to honor how beautifully they made it here." When the lighthouse's century-old lens was finally replaced with modern equipment, Raphael stood watching the crane lift the massive crystal from its brass housing. Sanchez appeared beside him, drawn by the weight of the moment. The old lens caught afternoon light as it descended, casting rainbow fragments across the harbor like scattered blessings. "Thank you," Raphael said to the departing lens, and no one thought it strange. The crew worked with unusual gentleness, as if they understood they were handling more than glass and metal. They were moving history itself. Word spread through the town, not as gossip but as quiet understanding. When something dear was completing its circle, Sanchez's presence somehow made the transition feel sacred rather than sad. Captain Bruno sought him out when selling his fishing boat, finding comfort in Sanchez's steady attention as he touched familiar wood one final time. Mrs. Chen closed her bait shop early one evening and sat with him on the pier, processing the news that her sister was moving inland. The distance feeling larger than mere miles, people began leaving chairs empty at farewell dinners, not for the departing person or thing, but for the space where gratitude could sit. Small silences became prayers, pauses became blessings. The town was learning, perhaps without realizing it, that endings could be kind if someone remembered to make room for them. Maya painted one final canvas during these weeks, the view from the lighthouse at the exact moment when day surrendered to evening, when the new beam first began its patient sweep across water holding early stars. But somehow she captured more than the visual scene. The painting held the feeling of standing at the threshold between familiar and unknown. As summer's golden conclusion approached, Sanchez understood finally that his unchanging nature wasn't a burden, but a gift that allowed him to hold space for others' beautiful transformations. He was learning to be a living lullaby, a constant, gentle presence that helped others feel safe enough to grow, to change, to let go when it was time. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, blessing the water with steady rhythm, and somewhere in the town below, people settled into evening routines that now included small ceremonies of gratitude. watched over by someone who understood that love, unlike seasons, never needs to end. On clear nights, when the harbor lay still as dark glass, and the lighthouse beam swept across water that held reflections of ancient stars, Sanchez and Maya began their most treasured ritual. They would climb the iron stairs together, carrying a thermos of mint tea and simple sandwiches, wrapped in brown paper, small offerings to the night that somehow tasted better when shared in the curved glass sanctuary above the world. From the lantern room, surrounded by windows that embraced the darkness, Maya would spread her astronomy charts, while Sanchez opened his journal to pages filled with celestial sketches, drawn across decades of patient watching. The great lens sent its blessing across the water in steady rhythm, and the stars began their unhurried conversation with anyone willing to listen. "There's Cassiopeia," Maya would whisper, pointing toward the constellation's distinctive W shape. "My textbook says it's named after a vain queen who boasted about her daughter's beauty." Sanchez would follow her gesture with eyes that held recognition deeper than books could carry. "I remember when sailors called her the Celestial M," he said softly. "They said she was a mother's love written in light, watching over every ship that dared the dark water. Before that, she was the great door, marking the entrance to the realm, where dreams learn to fly." These conversations became bridges between Maya's classroom knowledge and Sanchez's lived memory of how the same stars had guided different generations through their own dark waters. Maya began to understand that constellations told different stories depending on when you were looking at them, and that some patterns only became visible when you'd been watching long enough to see how they shifted and danced across decades. "Look for the spaces between," Sanchez taught her gently, his finger tracing invisible lines through darkness. "Sometimes what isn't lit is the thing that guides you. See there, the door, the nest, the pause. Negative constellations that hold their own quiet wisdom." Maya sketched these hidden patterns, her pencil moving by feeling more than sight, learning to see not just the stars, but the patient darkness that held them. Her paintings began to change during these hours, night skies that somehow captured both the moment and the eternity within it. She painted Polaris not just as a point of light, but as a heartbeat of constancy, pulsing with the steady rhythm of something that had been faithfully pointing toward home for longer than human memory could hold. One evening in late October, when the Milky Way spread across the sky like spilled flour, Maya made a discovery that shifted everything. Adjusting her small telescope, she noticed a faint star that seemed to pulse with its own internal music, brightening and dimming according to some mysterious rhythm. "This one's different," she said, guiding Sanchez to the eyepiece. "It's like it's breathing on its own schedule." Sanchez peered through the telescope and felt recognition bloom soft in his chest. "That's a variable star," he said with gentle certainty. "It brightens and dims according to its own internal song. Astronomers have been watching that particular one for over a century, learning its pattern." Maya lowered the telescope and studied his face in the starlight, understanding dawning like sunrise. "You've been watching it too, haven't you? Not from books or charts, but really watching." In that moment, she grasped something profound about her friend, that his gift wasn't just his unchanging appearance, but his ability to hold the long view, to see connections across time that others missed. Some stars took decades to reveal their true nature, and you had to be patient enough to witness their whole song. Her art transformed with this understanding. She began painting night skies that captured not just visible constellations, but the unseen narratives, the echoes of ancient myths, the feeling of time stretching infinitely. Her brushstrokes learned to convey not just the position of stars, but their patience, not just their brightness, but their stories. When she painted the lighthouse beam, it became more than light. It was a thread connecting moments, a pulse in the vast silence. As autumn deepened and her departure date drew closer, these evening vigils took on increased tenderness. They would sit in comfortable silence, Maya sketching while Sanchez wrote equations that somehow described the mathematics of memory. Sometimes they shared tea that stayed warm longer than it should, watching meteor showers paint brief silver lines across the darkness. "Make a wish," Maya would whisper when shooting stars traced their ephemeral paths. "I wish for you to find light wherever you go," Sanchez would reply, and Maya would feel something warm settle in her chest. Not just his blessing, but the understanding that some forms of love were patient enough to span any distance. Down in the town below, the stargazing became gently contagious. Children appeared on porches with blankets, inventing stories that made sense only in dream logic. Elena propped the library door open to let evening stars be seen from inside, and Iris sent up jars of rosemary sugar with notes that read, "For nights that want to be remembered." As they descended the lighthouse stairs each evening, their footsteps creating gentle echoes, Maya understood that departure didn't mean ending. The stars would continue their ancient dance whether she stayed or left. But knowing Sanchez would remain here, watching and remembering, made leaving feel less like abandonment and more like expansion, as if she were becoming part of a larger story rather than concluding a smaller one. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep, blessing the water with steady rhythm, and somewhere in the town below, people settled into dreams that carried the peace of knowing that some forms of constancy were strong enough to hold space for all kinds of beautiful change. The influence of Sanchez's gentle presence began to ripple through the harbor, town like morning light spreading across still water, touching corners of daily life without announcement or effort. It started in the smallest ways, Mrs. Patterson delivering mail with softer footsteps, pausing to notice how sunrise transformed ordinary mailboxes into something worthy of careful attention. Captain Bruno found himself speaking more quietly to his crew, discovering that whispered instructions somehow carried more weight than shouted commands. At the elementary school, Miss Rodriguez noticed her students approaching hurt animals with unusual patience, their small hands moving with the same careful tenderness they had observed during story hours at the library. When young Tommy found a sparrow with a damaged wing behind the school, he didn't rush to fix it or call for adult help. Instead, he sat quietly nearby, offering the bird the gift of peaceful company, while it decided whether it was ready to try flying again. The other children gathered in a careful circle, learning without words that sometimes the most loving thing you could do was simply stay close while something healed. The teenagers who had once raced through town with restless energy began taking time to help elderly neighbors without being asked. Sarah, now 17 and preparing for her own departure to university, spent afternoons reading to Mr. Henley, whose eyes had grown too dim for books, but whose love of stories remained bright. She read not with impatience to finish, but with the understanding that some gifts were measured in presence rather than productivity. Elena documented these changes in her personal journal, marveling at how one quiet soul could ripple outward through an entire community. "It's not that he teaches kindness," she wrote by lamplight. "It's that his way of being reminds people of their own capacity for gentleness, like he helps them remember who they already are at their most peaceful center." The transformation was perhaps most visible during the town's weekly market, where vendors began leaving small gifts with their produce, a sprig of mint with the tomatoes, a hand-drawn label explaining which apples were best for pies versus eating. Conversations lingered longer, not from lack of purpose but from genuine interest in each other's stories. When Mrs. Chen noticed the widow Morrison struggling with heavy bags, 3 different people offered help simultaneously, then laughed together at their shared impulse toward kindness. Iris, ever the gardener of both soil and souls, instituted what she called the pause, inviting anyone who wandered into the garden to sit for 5 minutes with their hands in the earth. "Plants don't hurry to bloom," she would say gently, and the most restless people surprised themselves by staying longer than they planned. Children learned to check the basil for bees before plucking a leaf. Teenagers, unsettled by their own changing bodies and new thoughts, discovered they could be still without being stuck. At the library, Sanchez continued his quiet work of mending books, but Elena noticed something remarkable happening around him. The building itself seemed to become more alive, more responsive to its visitors' needs. People arrived not just for books, but for the particular quality of peace that seemed to pool in corners, where afternoon light fell just right. Patrons stayed longer, not because they had more to read, but because they had discovered the restorative power of simply sitting quietly among stories. "He's taught us to be libraries ourselves," Elena realized one afternoon, watching a teenager help a young mother find picture books while her toddler napped peacefully in a stroller. "We're all becoming places where others can find what they need, not just information, but the feeling of being welcomed and understood." Even the harbor itself seemed to respond to the town's gentler rhythm. Boats returned from fishing trips with crews that worked in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized like dancers who had learned each other's patterns through patient practice. The gulls called more softly, and visitors often commented on the unusual peacefulness that seemed to emanate from the water itself. Sanchez watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, understanding finally that his immortality wasn't a burden to bear alone, but a gift that allowed him to model constancy in a world of constant change. He had become a living reminder that some forms of love were patient enough to wait, strong enough to endure, and gentle enough to help others feel safe in their own becoming. Maya captured this community transformation in a series of paintings she privately called the Ripple series, canvases that showed how one person's way of being could spread outward like light touching water. Her brushstrokes conveyed not just the visual changes, but the emotional shift, the way an entire town had learned to move through the world with increased tenderness. As her departure date approached, with autumn's golden conclusion, Maya understood that she wasn't just leaving a place, but a way of being that had been cultivated by Sanchez's patient presence. The gift wasn't something she could pack in her suitcase, but something she would carry in the way she approached new places and people, with the understanding that everyone deserved to be met with the same gentle attention Sanchez had shown her. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, blessing not just the water, but a community that had learned to be a blessing to itself, watched over by someone who understood that the most profound changes often happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the quiet persistence of choosing kindness in each small moment. As autumn painted the harbor in shades of amber and gold, Maya's 18th birthday arrived not with fanfare, but with the quiet understanding that some seasons were meant for gentle conclusions. The college acceptance letters lay on her desk like invitations to a future that felt both thrilling and impossibly distant from the familiar comfort of their harbor. Sanctuary Maya and Sanchez found themselves drawn to the garden more frequently during these weeks, not with urgency, but with the peaceful intention of dwelling fully in each shared moment. They spent long afternoons among Iris's roses, where the weight of sun on their shoulders felt precious now, each beam carrying the knowledge that such warmth would soon become memory rather than immediate experience. The sound of bees in the lavender took on increased sweetness, and even the way shadows moved across the ground seemed worthy of careful attention. Maya had begun her most ambitious painting yet, working on a canvas large enough to require an easel that Sanchez helped her carry to the garden's heart. Day after day, she layered colors with meditative purpose, capturing not just the visual beauty of their sanctuary, but its emotional resonance. The painting showed Sanchez surrounded by all the town's seasons at once, winter's depth reflected in his eyes, spring's renewal in his gentle smile, summer's constancy in his stillness, autumn's wisdom in the way light fell around him. "I want to paint the way it feels to be completely known," she said one afternoon, stepping back to study her work. The canvas somehow conveyed the essence of someone who held space for others' growth without needing to change himself, someone who had taught her that love could be both constant and freeing. When the painting was finished, she unveiled it in the soft light of late afternoon. Sanchez looked at it for a long time, his gaze moving across the canvas with quiet wonder. "You've painted every moment we've shared," he said simply. "And every moment is beautiful." In return, Sanchez took Maya's worn sketchbook and on a fresh page created something that transcended words. Using delicate lines and gentle symbols, he wrote her a lullaby meant to be traced rather than read, marks that seemed to hum with the rhythm of waves against shore, leaves rustling in evening breeze, the lighthouse beam's patient sweep. It was a visual song designed to help her find her way back to quiet whenever the world felt overwhelming. "This will remind you of the spaces between moments," he said, handing the journal back to her. "When you need to remember how to be still." Their conversations during these final weeks took on the quality of gifts they were giving each other for all the different kinds of growing they would need to do. They talked about carrying home within yourself, about recognizing kindness in new places, about the understanding that some forms of love were patient enough to span any distance. As September deepened, they climbed the lighthouse stairs together, for what they both knew would be one of their last shared ascents. From the lantern room, surrounded by glass that embraced the gathering darkness, they watched the first stars emerge in the deepening sky. Maya had learned to see not just the constellations, but the patient darkness that held them, understanding now that some forms of love were like that, invisible but essential. The quiet constancy that allowed everything else to shine. "You'll carry this place with you," Sanchez said softly as the lighthouse beam began its evening sweep. "Not as something that holds you back, but as something that teaches you to recognize home wherever you find beauty and kindness." Maya nodded, feeling not sadness but profound gratitude that seemed to make every shared moment more vivid. She understood that departure didn't mean ending, but expansion. That she was not just leaving a place but carrying forward a way of being in the world, with patience, with wonder, with the gentle attention Sanchez had modeled in every interaction. Elena prepared a quiet farewell dinner at the library, with candles casting warm light across tables where the whole community gathered. But the most meaningful moments came in comfortable silence, feeling the weight of gratitude for all the ways their lives had intersected and enriched each other. On her final morning, Maya and Sanchez met at the pier, where they had first recognized each other as kindred spirits. The harbor wore silver mist like a gentle shawl, and they sat together as the sun climbed higher, feeling the particular peace that comes from knowing you have been truly seen and deeply loved. Maya's suitcases waited at the lighthouse, but for now there was simply this: two friends sharing one more sunrise, understanding that some connections were strong enough to span any distance, patient enough to last forever. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, blessing not just the water, but a friendship that had taught them both that love, in its truest form, knows how to hold on by learning how to let go. With Maya's departure settling into the harbor's rhythm like a gentle tide that had carried something precious toward distant shores, the town found itself adjusting to a new kind of quiet, not the silence of absence, but the peaceful hush that follows a beautiful song, when listeners linger with the last note still warming their hearts. Sanchez carried this feeling with him as he walked back toward the library. Understanding that some forms of love were strong enough to span any distance, patient enough to transform separation into a different kind of connection. Elena felt the shift, too, her years of devoted service to the library now drawing toward their own natural conclusion. She had been preparing quietly for retirement, her dreams turning toward a small cottage where she could tend her own garden and read for pure pleasure rather than professional duty. The timing felt right, as if Maya's departure had opened space for other kinds of gentle transitions. "It's time for new hands to guide these stories," Elena said one afternoon, her gaze resting on Sanchez as he carefully mended a cookbook whose spine had separated from too many years of faithful use. "Someone who understands that libraries are more than collections. They're sanctuaries where every visitor should feel welcomed home." Ms. Caldwell arrived the following week, carrying impressive credentials and genuine enthusiasm, but also the particular nervousness of someone trying to fill shoes that had been worn smooth by decades of patient service. She was young, efficient, with bright eyes that catalogued everything systematically, but Sanchez recognized in her expression the overwhelm of someone who sensed there were deeper currents here than any library science textbook had prepared her for. Elena, with her characteristic wisdom, suggested that Sanchez help with the transition, not as official staff, but as someone who understood the library's heart, how it served as more than an information center, how it functioned as a place where the community's soul could rest and remember itself. Sanchez spent mornings with Ms. Caldwell, teaching her the subtle arts that couldn't be found in any manual. He showed her how to notice when a child's restlessness meant they needed movement rather than stillness, how to sense when someone's question about gardening books was really a way of asking for comfort during a difficult season. Under his gentle guidance, she learned to recognize the difference between patrons seeking escape and those searching for understanding. The books want to be helpful, Sanchez explained one afternoon as they reshelved returns together, his hands moving with reverent care, but they need someone to introduce them properly. Like making connections at a gathering where everyone might discover unexpected friendships. Ms. Caldwell watched how he handled each volume as if greeting an old friend, how he seemed to know instinctively which shelf would welcome each story home. Gradually, her nervous efficiency transformed into purposeful calm, and the library began to feel less like a responsibility she was managing, and more like a living thing she was learning to tend. As autumn deepened, Sanchez began a new project that grew naturally from his conversations with Iris about being a living library. He set up a comfortable corner near the window, where afternoon light pooled like liquid gold, equipped with a simple recording device that Elena had discovered in storage. A handwritten sign, carefully lettered by Ms. Caldwell, invited the community. Share your stories, help us remember. Mrs. Patterson came first, settling into the chair with her morning coffee still steaming, sharing memories of delivering mail during the blizzard of '78, when she had to use cross-country skis to reach the lighthouse. Her voice carried the music of someone who had witnessed the harbor through decades of change. And she spoke of small kindnesses that had sustained the community through difficult winters. Captain Bruno followed, his weathered hands gesturing as he described fishing seasons when the harbor froze solid enough to walk on, when Aurora Borealis danced above the water, like spirits celebrating something too beautiful for words. Mr. Henley brought his collection of old photographs, pointing to faces and telling stories of people who had loved this place long before the current generation arrived. Each recording session became a gentle ceremony, with Sanchez offering tea that stayed warm longer than it should and asking questions that helped memories unfold naturally. He had learned the art of listening not just to words, but to the spaces between them, understanding that some stories needed patient silence to emerge fully. Ms. Caldwell marveled at how these sessions transformed the library's atmosphere, making it feel less like an institution and more like an extended family's living room where everyone's story mattered. She began to understand that Sanchez's gift wasn't just his unchanging presence, but his ability to help others recognize their own capacity for creating lasting connections across generations. As winter approached, with its promise of quiet months perfect for reflection, the Oral History Project became woven into the library's daily rhythm. People would stop by not just for books, but to add their voices to the growing collection of memories that helped the town remember its own continuity. Elena, preparing for her final weeks as head librarian, watched these developments with deep satisfaction. "You're becoming the town's memory keeper," she observed, seeing how Sanchez's presence helped people access stories they hadn't thought about in years. A living bridge between what was and what is, the lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep, blessing not just the water, but a community that was learning to honor its own story, watched over by someone who understood that the most precious tales were the ones that helped people feel part of something beautiful and enduring. Years flowed like gentle tides around the harbor, each season carrying its own quiet transformations, while Sanchez remained the town's constant heartbeat. The Oral History Project had grown into something beyond Elena's original vision, not just an archive, but a living testament to the way stories connect generations across the patient sweep of time. Ms. Caldwell, now seasoned in the library's deeper rhythms, had learned to recognize when someone arrived carrying untold memories that wanted to find their way onto the small cassettes lined up like sleeping birds in wooden drawers. The garden responded to Sanchez's guardianship with the same mysterious abundance it had shown Iris, though now he tended it with hands that had learned her particular wisdom, how to listen for what wanted to grow, how to make space without forcing change. Winter flowers still bloomed in autumn's amber light. Spring bulbs pushed through snow with determined grace, and the ancient apple tree bore fruit that tasted different each year, as if it were experimenting with new ways to offer sweetness to the world. When Maya returned for her third visit since leaving for art school, she brought with her something more precious than her paintings or her stories of gallery successes. A small girl with dark hair that caught sunlight like water moved beside her, approaching the world with the same fearless curiosity Maya had once shown, but tempered with her own particular gentleness. "This is Luna," Maya said softly, watching as her 5-year-old daughter approached Sanchez with the unhurried confidence of someone recognizing a kindred spirit. "She's been asking about the boy who reads with his fingers ever since I showed her your painting." Luna settled beside Sanchez on the weathered stone bench without invitation or hesitation, her small hand reaching to trace the cover of his eternal journal. "Mama says you help flowers remember how to bloom," she said matter-of-factly, as if such magic was simply another fact about the world. Like the way morning light turned ordinary things beautiful. Flowers already know how to bloom, Sanchez replied gently, opening his journal to a page filled with sketches of roses in impossible seasons. Sometimes they just need someone to sit quietly nearby while they remember their own courage. As afternoon light pooled around them like liquid gold, Sanchez showed Luna the garden's secret rhythms, how to approach sleeping bees without disturbing their dreams, how to listen for the whispered conversations between different plants, how to recognize the exact moment when a bud decided it was ready to unfold. Luna absorbed these lessons like earth-absorbing gentle rain, her questions revealing an artist's eye inherited from her mother, but uniquely her own, Iris, now moving through the garden with slower steps but hands no less sure, delighted in Luna's presence. Some children are born knowing how to tend growing things, she observed, watching Luna carefully arrange fallen leaves according to some pattern only she could see. They understand that beauty is something to be shared rather than hoarded. During their week-long visit, Luna became another thread in the tapestry of connection that Sanchez had learned to weave across generations. She painted with watercolors that seemed to capture not just images, but emotions, creating pictures that made viewers remember their own moments of wonder. Her laughter joined the garden's music, adding new notes to melodies that had been growing richer with each passing season. Maya watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction, recognizing in her daughter the same gift for making ordinary moments feel sacred that had first drawn her to Sanchez all those years ago. "She sees you the way I did," Maya observed one evening as they climbed the lighthouse stairs together. Not as someone unusual, but as someone completely himself, as Luna grew during subsequent visits from 5 to 7 to 9, her presence revealed how the town's gentle transformation had deepened into something permanent and self-sustaining. Children who had learned patience from Sanchez's example were now young adults who carried that same careful attention into their own work and relationships. The teenagers who had discovered the peace of sitting quietly in Iris's garden were now parents who read bedtime stories with unhurried voices, understanding that some gifts were measured in presence rather than productivity. Elena, visiting occasionally from her cottage, where she tended her own small garden, would sit beside Sanchez watching Luna chase butterflies with the focused attention she brought to everything. "You've shown us that some stories aren't meant to end," Elena would say, her voice soft with gratitude. "They just change the way they're told, carried forward by new voices and new hearts." As autumn painted the harbor in familiar shades of amber and gold, Sanchez reflected on the beautiful continuity he had witnessed, how love moved like light through generations, each person carrying forward what they had received, while adding their own particular brightness to the ongoing story. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, blessing not just the water, but a community that had learned to honor both constancy and change, watched over by someone who understood that the most profound gifts were the ones that helped others discover their own capacity for creating lasting beauty in an ever-changing world. The morning iris didn't appear among the roses for her usual dawn conversation with the garden. Sanchez felt the absence like a change in the harbor's breathing. For 43 years, she had greeted each sunrise along the moss-softened paths, her silver hair catching early light as she moved with the grace of someone completely at home in her chosen sanctuary. When the sun climbed higher, and still no gentle footsteps whispered through the herbs, Sanchez made his way toward her cottage with the quiet understanding that some seasons complete themselves while the world sleeps. He found her in the garden's heart, settled peacefully on the weathered stone bench where they had shared countless afternoons of patient wisdom. Her hands rested folded in her lap, holding a sprig of rosemary, her face carrying the deep contentment of someone who had lived fully and loved generously. The morning light fell across her like a blessing, and the moonflowers, impossibly, had opened their trumpet petals to the dawn, defying their nocturnal nature as if offering a final, luminous farewell. Sanchez sat beside her for a long moment, not trying to change what had happened, but simply being present with the completion of a life that had touched the earth with infinite tenderness. When Elena arrived, drawn by some intuitive understanding that this morning required gentle witnessing, she found them there together, the eternal boy and the woman, who had taught him that some forms of tending require nothing more than faithful presence. On the bench, Beside Iris lay an envelope with Sanchez's name written in her careful script. Inside, words that smelled of chamomile and carried the weight of blessing. Dear Keeper of Seasons, thank you for showing me that constancy and change can dance together like partners who have learned each other's rhythm. The garden knows your hands now. Trust it to show you what it needs. Remember that the most beautiful things grow not because we force them, but because we make space for their own mysterious timing. Plant moonflowers in my memory. They understand about finding light in darkness. The town gathered naturally, as news traveled in the gentle way of small communities where everyone's story matters. Not a funeral, but a celebration that honored Iris's love of growing things, with people wearing colors that reflected her garden, sage green and lavender, rose gold and deep earth brown. Children brought drawings of flowers. Adults shared stories of wisdom she had offered during difficult seasons, and teenagers read poems about seeds that sleep patiently until spring calls them home. Following her wishes, they created a memorial garden in the space behind the library where she had first taught Sanchez the old names of things. Everyone contributed, soil from their own gardens, seeds saved from favorite plants, stones worn smooth by the harbor's patient tides. Ms. Caldwell organized the planting with efficiency, tempered by reverence, understanding they were creating not just a memorial, but a living prayer that would bloom across seasons yet to come. Luna, now visiting with paint-stained fingers and an artist's eye that saw beauty in both permanence and change, approached the memorial plantings with cathedral reverence. She had brought watercolor paintings of all the flowers Iris had taught her to recognize, arranging them carefully around the moonflower bed like visual blessings. She's still teaching us, Luna observed with the clarity that sometimes emerges from young hearts. Every time we remember to be gentle with growing things. As autumn settled over the harbor with its familiar palette of amber and gold, Sanchez found himself officially appointed as the garden's guardian, though the title felt unnecessary. The plants responded to his care with the same mysterious abundance they had shown Iris, as if her spirit had blessed his hands with particular wisdom. He understood now that his immortality wasn't a burden to bear alone, but a profound gift that allowed him to hold space for others' beautiful mortality, to be a living memory of their fleeting joys and quiet wisdom. In his journal that evening, he wrote about the mathematics of memory, equations that described how love multiplies rather than divides when shared across generations. He sketched the memorial garden where moonflowers would soon bloom with ethereal beauty, their petals opening at dusk to release fragrance that carried the memory of every evening Iris had spent among the roses, teaching him that the most precious stories were the ones that help people feel part of something beautiful and enduring. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, blessing not just the water, but a community that had learned to honor both endings and continuations. Watched over by someone who understood that the most beautiful memorials were the ones that kept growing, kept giving, kept reminding everyone who encountered them that love, in its truest form, never really ends. The seasons continued their patient dance around the harbor, each one carrying its own quiet transformations, while Sanchez remained the town's gentle constant. Winter settled softly that year, mindful of the fresh moonflower bed and the new ways the community had learned to carry its memories forward. Snow dusted the memorial garden, where Iris's spirit seemed to linger in every carefully tended plant, and the lighthouse beam swept across water that held reflections of ancient stars, blessing another year of stories with its steady rhythm. In the library, Ms. Caldwell had grown into her stewardship like ivy, finding its rightful wall, learning to lead by tending rather than directing. The oral history project had blossomed beyond Elena's original vision, filling wooden drawers with cassettes that held the town's living memory. Voices from different generations created a soft-breathing chorus that anyone could enter. Stories of storms that changed their minds at the last moment, of sandwiches carried to neighbors' porches that became 20-year traditions, of garden gates left open by mistake that became the reason two people met and stayed. The town discovered that tenderness, when recorded, could become a kind of architecture for the heart. Sanchez moved through these winter months with the unhurried grace that had always marked his presence, but now his journal filled differently. Less occupied with equations that tried to explain the mathematics of time, the pages bloomed with beloved particulars, Mrs. Patterson's careful footsteps on the hill, Captain Bruno's habit of tying doubled knots when thinking deeply, the way Elena's hands folded like prayers when someone found exactly the book they needed, each name accompanied by tiny constellations of habits and hopes that made individual lives shine with their own irreplaceable light. When spring arrived early in the memorial garden, as it always did around Sanchez, the moonflowers kept their promise to Iris's memory. They opened at dusk with patient joy, releasing fragrance that drifted like echoes of her gentle laughter. Luna returned with taller legs and new seriousness around her eyes, though her hands still approached bees like old friends. She brought a watercolor for the memorial bed, pale trumpet flowers unfurling under a sky the color of held breath. "I painted the part that's almost open," she said with quiet pride, "because that's the best part, when something beautiful is about to happen." Letters arrived regularly from Maya, scented faintly with city rain and gesso, filled with descriptions of galleries, where her paintings helped viewers remember their own capacity for wonder. She sent photographs too, canvases that seemed lit from within, including one night sky that stretched across a wall bearing a lighthouse beam like a pulse line. In the corner, almost hidden, sat a small figure with a journal. Not quite a portrait, but close enough that Sanchez traced the edges with his fingertips and felt the warm memory of charcoal and midnight. Conversations in the lantern room, the children who had once gathered for story hour returned as teachers, shopkeepers, nurses, and sailors. They paused at the library door with the reverence people show when entering places where names are spoken kindly. And they still called him by the same simple name, treating his constancy like trusted weather, acknowledging it, adjusting to it, letting it be the steady point around which their own changes could safely orbit. As evening settled over the harbor, like a familiar blanket woven from starlight and salt air, Sanchez climbed the lighthouse stairs with his eternal journal. From the observation deck, the town spread below like a constellation of warm windows, each light representing another thread in the tapestry he had helped weave across generations. Ms. Caldwell closed the library with Elena's taut reverence, and the memorial garden glowed softly, where moonflowers released their nightly blessing. Opening his journal to fresh pages, Sanchez began to write in simple words that flowed like water, finding its way to the sea. He wrote about the boy who had arrived with morning fog, carrying only questions and infinite capacity for patient attention. He wrote about Elena's gift of sanctuary, Iris's wisdom about growing things, Maya's courage to chase light while carrying home in her heart. The pages filled with names and faces, each one a star in the larger constellation of what it meant to love without conditions, to remain constant while everything else changed. As dawn approached with silver mist settling over the harbor like a gentle shawl, Sanchez understood finally that his immortality had become not burden but blessing, the ability to serve as a living bridge between generations, helping each new arrival feel part of something larger and more enduring than their individual stories. His purpose wasn't to solve the mystery of his existence, but to be a living lullaby, a constant gentle presence that helped others feel safe enough to grow, to love, to let go with grace when time called them toward new seasons. The lighthouse beam continued its eternal sweep, and somewhere in the town below, people settled into dreams that carried the peace of knowing some forms of love were patient enough to last forever, watched over by someone who had learned that constancy and change could dance together like partners who had discovered each other's perfect rhythm. And with that, understanding settling around him like morning light, he stretched toward the horizon where sky met sea, becoming part of the eternal dance between memory and hope, between stories that had been told and one still waiting to unfold. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.